Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
Before we begin, let me know where you're tuning in from down in the comments, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale. The late afternoon sun, the color of bruised peaches, was beginning its slow dip behind the oak trees lining Primrose Lane. Inside number 27, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady thrum against the oppressive August heat. Michael Anderson, a man who found comfort in the predictable, leaned back in his worn leather recliner, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on his chest. Next month, 30 years. 30 years with Sarah. The thought, usually a warm ember, now carried a faint, unidentifiable chill. Sarah was in the kitchen, the clinking of pans and the scent of roasting chicken, her signature Sunday dinner, weaving through the usual quiet of their home. She'd been humming earlier, a cheerful, slightly off-key tune that normally would have made him smile. Today, it just felt loud. He'd been noticing little things lately, a new skittishness in her eyes when he asked about her day. Phone calls taken in hushed tones in the other room. Last week, she'd snapped at him when he'd innocently asked who she was texting so late, her defensiveness a stark contrast to their usual open communication, and the charity committee meetings that stretched longer and longer into the evenings. He'd chalked it up to stress, the upcoming 30th anniversary perhaps weighing on her too, in its own way. "Michael, honey, can you grab my phone from the counter? I think I left it there," Sarah called out, her voice a little too bright. He pushed himself up, the crossword sliding to the floor. "Sure thing." Her phone lay beside the fruit bowl, a sleek, modern device he'd gifted her last Christmas. As he reached for it, the screen lit up. A notification. He wouldn't normally look. Privacy was a given between them, an unspoken pact. But the name on the screen wasn't one he recognized from her usual circle of friends. David H. And then, the preview text, stark and brutal against the vibrant background of her lock screen. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again, feel you again?" The air in Michael's lungs turned to ice. The aroma of roasting chicken, moments ago a comforting anchor, now reeked of something acrid, something rotten. The humming of the AC unit morphed into a high-pitched whine, drilling into his skull. "Feel you again." The words were a physical blow, stealing his breath, leaving a gaping, winded hole in his chest. David H. He racked his brain. David Harper? The new guy on that fundraising committee Sarah had been so engrossed with? The one she'd described as a bit lonely but charming? His hand, an entity separate from his frozen mind, closed around the cool metal of the phone. It wasn't password protected. Why would it be? They had nothing to hide from each other, or so he'd believed. With a tremor he couldn't control, his thumb swiped across the screen. The message thread opened, a venomous serpent uncoiling before his eyes. Not just one message, a cascade. Weeks, no, months of them. Flirtatious banter, inside jokes he wasn't privy to, coded references to shared moments. And then, more explicit, plans for clandestine meetings, emojis that made his stomach clench, compliments about her laugh, her touch, things he hadn't heard her direct at him in years. "Your skin was so soft." That little restaurant was our secret, right? "Can't wait for Michael's golf trip next weekend. Long overdue us time." The last one hit him like a punch to the gut. His golf trip, planned months ago. She'd seemed almost eager for him to go. He felt a wave of nausea so intense he had to grip the edge of the granite countertop, his knuckles white. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. A grotesque distortion of the life he knew, the woman he loved, his Sarah, the mother of his children, the woman he was supposed to grow old with. "Michael? Everything okay out there? Did you find it?" Sarah's voice, closer now, laced with a hint of impatience. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the glowing screen, each word a fresh betrayal, a new shard of glass embedding itself in his heart. The world he'd meticulously built over 3 decades, a world he'd thought was solid granite, was crumbling into dust around him. And the architect of its destruction was humming in the next room, asking about her phone. He walked back into the living room. Sarah's phone clutched in his hand like a live grenade. His legs felt like lead, each step an immense effort. Sarah was by the mantelpiece, adjusting a framed photo of their two daughters, Olivia and Chloe, smiling brightly from a sun-drenched beach vacation years ago. A wave of something akin to pity, quickly extinguished by a surge of raw fury, washed over him. She turned, a practiced smile on her face. "There you are. What took you so—" Her voice trailed off as she saw his expression. The smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable apprehension. Guilt? "Sarah," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "Who is David H.?" The color drained from her face. For a split second, she looked genuinely startled, like a deer caught in headlights. Then, the shutters came down, her expression smoothed into one of careful, almost patronizing concern. "David? David Harper? He's on the committee with me. Why do you ask, honey? Is something wrong?" "Don't honey me, Sarah." The words were colder than he intended, sharper. He held up her phone, the screen still illuminated with the damning messages. I saw the texts." She stared at the phone, then at him, her eyes wide. But there was no immediate denial, no outburst of righteous indignation. Instead, a calculated pause. He could almost see the gears turning in her head, formulating a defense, a way to spin this. "Michael, you've got it all wrong," she said, her voice regaining a semblance of steadiness, though a slight tremor betrayed her. She took a step towards him, hands outstretched. "It's not what it looks like. David, he's just a friend. He's been going through a hard time since his wife passed. I've been a shoulder to cry on. He sometimes gets a little overly familiar in his texts. You know how some people are." A bitter laugh escaped Michael's lips. "A shoulder to cry on? Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again, feel you again? Is that how friends talk, Sarah? Is that the kind of comfort you offer?" Tears welled in her eyes. Predictable. Always the tears. "Michael, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was a moment of weakness, a mistake. It didn't mean anything. It was a stupid, one-time thing. I was lonely. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in your work." The deflection, the blame shift. He'd almost expected it. "Distant?" he repeated, incredulous. "I've been distant? Or have you been too busy with your committee work to notice me, Sarah?" He saw the lie in her eyes, the carefully constructed narrative crumbling. "How long, Sarah? How long has this one-time thing been going on?" She averted her gaze, busying herself with a non-existent speck of dust on the mantel. "It's not important. What's important is us, Michael. Our family. 30 years. Are you going to throw all that away for one silly mistake?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Don't you dare call this a silly mistake. Don't you dare try to minimize what you've done." He watched her, the woman he thought he knew, now a stranger standing before him, her face a mask of carefully feigned remorse. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperate attempt to salvage the situation, not for them, but for her. She reached for him then, tried to lay a hand on his arm. "Michael, I love you. Only you. Please, we can fix this." He flinched away as if her touch burned him. "Don't," he said, the word a raw wound. The coldness he felt wasn't just anger, it was a profound, chilling emptiness where trust and love used to reside. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that this was far from a silly mistake. This was a betrayal of a magnitude he was only just beginning to comprehend. The house felt like a tomb that night. Sarah had retreated to the guest room after a tearful, circular argument that resolved nothing, her protestations of a single lapse in judgment ringing hollow against the mountain of evidence on her phone. Michael lay awake in their marital bed, the space beside him a cold, gaping void. Sleep was impossible. His mind raced, replaying every text, every deceitful smile, every carefully constructed lie. Driven by a desperate need for more answers, for the full, unvarnished truth, he rose before dawn. He found Sarah's iPad on the kitchen counter, left there from the previous evening. He knew her passcode, or thought he did. It was their anniversary date. Easy. He navigated to her messages, his heart pounding. He scrolled past the damning exchanges with David H. And then he saw it group chats, one with Olivia, one with Chloe, and then one with all three of them, Mom, Liv, and Chloe. His blood ran cold. With trembling fingers, he tapped it open. The messages scrolled back for weeks, months. Olivia. Mom, Dad's got that conference call all afternoon. If you want to meet Dee, today's good. Just be back before 6. Chloe. Mom, are you sure about this? What if Dad finds out? I'm scared for you. Sarah. Girls, stop worrying. Your father suspects nothing. And Chloe, sweetie, sometimes a woman needs a little excitement. Your old man isn't exactly lighting my fire these days. Besides, David makes me feel alive. Olivia. Okay, just be smart. We'll cover for you. Told Dad you were having lunch with me today. He bought it. Chloe. I feel so guilty. Sarah. Don't be. You're helping your mother find a little happiness. Think of it that way. Michael felt the bile rise in his throat. It wasn't just complicity. It was active participation. His daughters, his own flesh and blood, conspiring with their mother to deceive him, to facilitate her affair. They were her alibis, her lookouts. The spa day Olivia had supposedly taken Sarah on last month. Chloe's insistence that Mom needed a girls' weekend away to distress. All lies. All part of the elaborate charade. E didn't wait. He went upstairs and woke them, first Olivia, then Chloe. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cold fury in his eyes was enough. He confronted them in the living room, Sarah's iPad on the coffee table, the damning messages displayed for all to see. Olivia, ever the pragmatist, tried to brazen it out. Dad, it's not what you think. Mom was just unhappy. We didn't want to see her miserable. We were trying to protect the family, to stop things from blowing up. Protect the family. Michael's voice was dangerously quiet. By helping your mother betray me? By lying to my face day after day? Is that your definition of protection, Olivia? Chloe predictably burst into tears. Daddy, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. Mom said she said you wouldn't understand. She said it would destroy everything if you knew. I was scared. Scared of what, Chloe? Michael pressed, his gaze unwavering. Scared of me? Or scared of your mother's manipulations? The silence that followed was deafening. He looked from one daughter to the other, their faces etched with guilt and fear. These were the children he had raised, taught right from wrong, showered with love and support. And they had chosen to stand with their mother, to become partners in her deceit. The pain was a physical entity, crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. First Sarah, now his daughters. He was utterly, devastatingly alone, adrift in a sea of betrayal. The foundation of his entire world had not just cracked, it had been systematically demolished by the very people he trusted most. The rest of that day passed in a blur of numb disbelief and simmering rage. Michael moved through the motions a stilted, silent breakfast, the girls tiptoeing around him like frightened mice, Sarah making herself scarce. He couldn't look at them, couldn't bear the sight of their duplicity. He didn't sleep that night either. The initial shock was solidifying into something harder, colder, a resolve. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wouldn't be. Using his laptop, shielded by the darkness of his study, he began to dig. He was a methodical man by nature, an engineer whose mind thrived on logic and detail. He applied that same precision to unraveling the tangled web of his wife's secret life. He went through shared cloud accounts, old email archives, anything he could access. He cross-referenced dates from Sarah's phone with credit card statements, looking for unexplained hotel bills, expensive restaurant charges, gifts he hadn't purchased, and then he found them. Tucked away in a mislabeled folder in their shared photo cloud, a folder he'd never had reason to open before, Weekend Getaway Charleston. Sarah had told him it was a solo trip, a writer's retreat she needed for inspiration for a local charity newsletter she was supposedly working on. That was 2 years ago. The photos were sickeningly intimate. Sarah and David Harper, arm in arm, strolling down cobblestone streets. Sarah laughing, head thrown back, gazing adoringly at David as he whispered something in her ear. A picture of them raising champagne glasses in a fancy restaurant, a celebratory gleam in their eyes. And then, the one that made his stomach drop, a selfie of them in a hotel room, an unmade bed in the background. Sarah wearing a new silk robe he'd never seen before. On David's wrist, a distinctive watch. On Sarah's finger, beside her wedding band, a delicate silver ring with a small, unfamiliar gemstone, a ring he certainly hadn't given her. It looked like a promise, a secret token of their illicit bond. 2 years, at least. Not a silly mistake. Not a moment of weakness. This was a sustained, calculated affair, a double life. The pain was still there, a dull, throbbing ache, but now it was overlaid with an icy determination. He meticulously downloaded every photo, every incriminating email, every piece of evidence, organizing it into clearly labeled files. He was no longer just grieving a broken marriage, he was building a case. He thought of all the times he'd felt a vague unease, a subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor, and dismissed it as his own overthinking. The late nights she'd attributed to committee work. The sudden, unexplained need for personal space. The way she'd subtly pulled away from his touch. All the puzzle pieces, once disparate and confusing, now clicked into place, forming a horrifying, undeniable picture of deceit. The love he'd felt for Sarah, the deep, abiding affection that had been the bedrock of his life for 3 decades, began to wither, replaced by a cold, hard anger. And beneath that anger, a chilling resolve was taking root. He would not be played for a fool any longer. He would not let them destroy him and walk away unscathed. The ice was forming around his heart, and with it, the first stirrings of a plan. He would uncover every lie, every betrayal. And then, he would make them pay. Understood. I've reviewed the previous chapters and the outline for Part 2. We will now proceed with Chapters 58, focusing on Michael's deeper understanding of Sarah's deceit and David Harper's true nature, culminating in his decision to take decisive action. I will adhere strictly to the details outlined for Part 2 and maintain all stylistic and content requirements. The days that followed the initial confrontations were a strange, suffocating ballet of strained silences and forced civility. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, her face a carefully composed mask of sorrow, occasionally punctuated by dramatic sighs or a well-timed sniffle when she thought Michael was looking. But he was looking, always looking now, with eyes stripped bare of illusion, and what he saw beneath the performance chilled him to the bone. Her concern, he realized, wasn't for him, for the devastation she'd wrought upon their 30 years together. It was for herself. He saw it in the furtive glances she cast his way, not of remorse, but of assessment, trying to gauge his next move, the potential damage to her comfortable life, her social standing. When she spoke, her words were honeyed with false contrition, but her eyes darted around, calculating. "Michael, can't we just talk about this?" she'd plead, her voice a soft caress that once would have melted him. "People make mistakes. Surely our marriage is strong enough to weather one storm?" "A storm, Sarah?" he'd reply, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion she was clearly trying to provoke. "This isn't a storm. This is a demolition." He remembered an incident from years ago, something he'd dismissed at the time as an uncharacteristic lapse. Sarah had been treasurer for the local PTA, and there had been a discrepancy in the accounts, a few $1,000s unaccounted for. She'd been frantic, tearful, blaming a bookkeeping error, a new software glitch. He'd believed her, of course. He'd even quietly covered the shortfall himself to save her embarrassment, writing it off as one of those unfortunate, inexplicable things. Now, that memory resurfaced with a sickening clarity. Had that been David? Or a precursor to the kind of deceit she was capable of? One evening, he found her in their walk-in closet, not weeping over old photo albums as a truly heartbroken woman might, but meticulously sorting through her designer handbags and expensive shoes, a strange, almost predatory gleam in her eyes, as if she were taking inventory of what she could salvage. When she realized he was watching, she jumped, a startled gasp escaping her lips. "Oh, Michael, you frightened me." "Just wondering what you're up to," he said, his tone neutral. "Just tidying," she'd stammered, her gaze flicking towards a particularly expensive Italian leather tote. "Things have been so chaotic." Later, when she thought he was asleep, he heard her on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was not that of a grieving wife. It was the tone of a conspirator, a strategist. The final illusion of Sarah, the loving, devoted wife, shattered. In her place stood a woman he didn't recognize, a cold, calculating opportunist who had worn the mask of affection for years. When she finally realized that her tears and feigned remorse weren't working, that he wasn't going to simply forgive and forget, a new expression settled on her face. A chilling hardness, a subtle glint of defiance, almost a challenge. It was as if she were daring him to do his worst, confident she could still somehow manipulate her way out of the wreckage she had created. The image of David Harper, the smirking face in those Charleston photos, the casual possessiveness in his messages to Sarah haunted Michael. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal. It was about the man who had been her accomplice, the serpent in their carefully cultivated garden. Michael needed to know who this man truly was. He considered hiring a private investigator, but the thought of involving another stranger in the intimate details of his shattered life felt unbearable. Instead, he turned to the impersonal, anonymous depths of the internet, his engineering mind adept at sifting through data, connecting disparate pieces of information. He started with a simple search, David Harper, combined with their town, then expanded to surrounding areas. The initial results were innocuous, a sparse LinkedIn profile listing vague consulting work, a few mentions on local charity event websites always in connection with Sarah's committees. But Michael dug deeper, using reverse image searches on the Charleston photos, cross-referencing names and locations. Then, a hit. An old news article from a small-town newspaper a few states over dated 5 years prior. Local businessman accused of fraud, emotional distress by former partner. The businessman's name was David M. Harper. The photo accompanying the article, though grainier and showing a slightly younger man, was unmistakably him. The article detailed how Harper had allegedly charmed a wealthy widow, convinced her to invest heavily in a non-existent real estate venture, and then disappeared, leaving her financially ruined and emotionally devastated. There were mentions of other similar accusations, though none had apparently resulted in criminal charges, always settled out of court or dropped due to lack of concrete evidence. A cold dread seeped into Michael. This wasn't just some lonely colleague Sarah had misguidedly fallen for. David Harper was a predator, a con artist who specialized in women like Sarah affluent, perhaps a little bored or feeling unappreciated, susceptible to charm and flattery. He kept digging, his search terms becoming more specific. He found online forums, comment sections on old articles, where other women, using anonymous screen names, shared eerily similar stories of a charming, sophisticated man named David, or D.H., who had swept them off their feet, promised them the world, and then bled them dry, emotionally and financially. The pattern was undeniable. The realization hit Michael with the force of a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just stumbled into an affair. She had been targeted. Or perhaps more disturbingly, had she willingly, knowingly become entangled with a man like this? Was her own avarice, her own dissatisfaction, a beacon for such a man? The committee work Harper was involved in with Sarah suddenly took on a more sinister light. Were those legitimate charities or fronts? Was Sarah a victim, a fool blinded by a practiced charmer? Or was she, in some twisted way, his accomplice, drawn to the illicit thrill, the potential for gain? The lines were blurring, and the truth, Michael suspected, was far uglier than he could have ever imagined. Armed with the chilling knowledge of David Harper's predatory past, Michael redoubled his efforts to uncover the full extent of Sarah's deception. The Charleston photos were just the tip of the iceberg. He now understood that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was potentially about a systematic plundering of their shared life. He spent hours in his study, poring over bank statements, credit card bills, investment portfolios, documents he'd largely entrusted Sarah to manage over the years, his own focus consumed by his demanding career. He'd always believed in partnership, in mutual trust. Now that trust felt like an almost criminal naivete. The discrepancies began to emerge, small at first, then growing into an undeniable pattern. Regular cash withdrawals from their joint account, always just under the amount that might trigger a bank inquiry. Payments to unfamiliar companies, vague consulting fees. Then, a larger discovery, a separate credit card statement, in Sarah's name only, addressed to a P.O. box he hadn't known existed. He managed to access the account online through a series of security question guesses: their first dog's name, her mother's maiden name, details of a life he thought they'd shared openly. The charges on that secret card painted a vivid picture of her double life: boutique hotels in nearby cities, expensive dinners for two at places Michael had never been, charges from high-end lingerie stores, jewelry shops. One charge stood out: a down payment on a timeshare condominium in a coastal resort town, a place Sarah had often mused about retiring to, a dream he thought they'd one day share. Clearly, she'd been planning a future, just not with him. The deepest cut, however, came when he finally gained access to an old, rarely used joint email account. He found a series of emails between Sarah and David, dating back nearly 3 years. Their early exchanges were flirtatious, filled with the thrill of a new secret romance. But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. They discussed Michael with a chilling detachment, almost as an obstacle. "M is so predictable," Sarah had written in one email. "He'll be working late again tonight. My place, 8 p.m. In another, David had replied to a complaint from Sarah about Michael's perceived lack of attention. "He doesn't appreciate what he has, darling, but I do. Soon we won't have to worry about the old man anymore." The old man. That's what he was to them. An inconvenience, a piggy bank. He read on, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. They spoke of their future together, that coastal condo, trips to Europe, a life of leisure and luxury, all seemingly funded by the assets Michael had spent a lifetime building. Every shared memory, every anniversary celebrated, every quiet evening spent together, now felt like a scene from a meticulously crafted play, with him as the unwitting, duped audience member. His entire marriage, the very foundation of his adult life, had been a lie, a long, elaborate, soul-crushing lie. The weight of Sarah's betrayal, compounded by the daughter's complicity and the predatory nature of David Harper, settled heavily on Michael. For days he walked around in a daze, the evidence he'd collected a toxic burden in his mind. The grief was immense, a gaping wound that throbbed with every breath. But beneath the grief, the icy resolve he'd felt forming earlier was now hardening into tempered steel. He would not let them win. He would not be a footnote in their sordid story. He needed a plan. He needed a professional. Mark Jenkins, his oldest friend and golfing buddy, had gone through a messy divorce a few years back. Michael remembered Mark mentioning his lawyer, a real shark, but fair. He called Mark. "Mikey, haven't heard from you. Everything all right? You missed our Saturday game." Mark's cheerful voice was a jarring contrast to the turmoil Michael was experiencing. "Not really, Mark. Not all right at all." Michael's voice was flat. "Listen, I need the name of your divorce lawyer, the one you said was effective." A moment of silence on the other end. "Oh man, Sarah? You and Sarah?" Mark sounded genuinely shocked. "What happened?" "It's a long story, Mark, a very ugly one. Just the lawyer's name, please." Mark gave him the name, Eleanor Thompson of Thompson and Associates. "She's tough, Michael. No nonsense. But she knows her stuff. You sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything in my life," Michael said, a grim finality in his tone. The next day, Michael sat in Eleanor Thompson's sleek, modern office. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed, with intelligent, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He'd brought his laptop, a meticulously organized file of his findings. He laid it all out: the text messages, the Charleston photos, the iPad conversations with his daughters, the financial discrepancies, the information about David Harper's past. He spoke calmly, factually, the engineer in him presenting data, but Miss Thompson, he could tell, saw the raw pain beneath the stoic facade. She listened intently, occasionally asking a sharp, pertinent question, her expression unreadable. When he finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Miss Thompson leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady on him. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is a profound betrayal on multiple levels. What you've uncovered is substantial." She paused. "What is it you want to achieve?" Michael met her gaze, his own now hard, resolute. "I want a divorce, Miss Thompson. I want to protect every asset I've worked my entire life for. I want to ensure that Sarah Anderson and her associate do not benefit another cent from me. And my daughters—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, the pain still fresh. "They made their choice. They chose to side with her, to lie to me, to enable this. I want them out of my will. I want all ties severed." Eleanor Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly at the last part, but she didn't comment immediately. She simply nodded. "That is a very clear objective, Mr. Anderson, and a legally complex one, particularly regarding disinheritance, but not impossible given the circumstances you've outlined. We will need to be strategic, meticulous." "I understand," Michael said. "I want them to understand the consequences of their actions, all of them." "Then," Miss Thompson said, a glint of steel in her own eyes, "let's get to work. We will make sure justice, in its own way, is served." Leaving her office, Michael felt a sliver of something he hadn't felt in days, a grim sense of purpose. The path ahead would be brutal, agonizing, but it was a path he had to take. There was no turning back now. He had reached his point of no return. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings with Eleanor Thompson. Her office, with its panoramic view of the city skyline, became a war room where Michael, under her shrewd guidance, began to construct his offensive. Miss Thompson was a formidable presence, sharp, direct, and possessing an encyclopedic knowledge of marital law and financial chicanery. "All right, Michael," she'd begin each session, a stack of documents already neatly arranged before her. "Let's review the financials. We need to trace every penny Sarah has moved, every asset she's tried to conceal. They pored over years of bank statements, tax returns, property deeds, and investment portfolios. Miss Thompson had a knack for spotting irregularities Michael had overlooked in his initial grief-stricken investigation. She pointed out patterns of spending, unexplained transfers, and assets held solely in Sarah's name that should have been marital property. The Charleston photos and the emails with David Harper establish clear grounds for adultery, which can influence spousal support in this state, though not always asset division directly, Miss Thompson explained, tapping a pen against a document. However, what we're uncovering here, the potential siphoning of marital funds, the secret credit card, the P.O. box, that's where we can really build a strong case for financial misconduct or dissipation of assets, as we call it. That will significantly impact the settlement in your favor." The conversations often turned to Olivia and Chloe. "Disinheriting your children is a drastic step, Michael," Miss Thompson said one afternoon, her tone softening slightly. "The courts will scrutinize it. We need to ensure your will is ironclad, clearly stating your reasons, so it cannot be easily contested on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity." "They weren't unduly influenced, Miss Thompson," Michael stated, his voice hard. "They were willing participants. They made their choice. I'm simply acknowledging it." He felt a familiar pang of sorrow, but it was quickly overshadowed by the cold steel of his resolve. During one deep dive into old paperwork, Miss Thompson's sharp eyes caught something. "Look at this," she said, sliding a document across the polished mahogany table. It was a loan application for a small home equity line of credit taken out 5 years ago, an amount Michael vaguely remembered Sarah saying was for some necessary home repairs. "That's your signature, isn't it?" Michael nodded. "Yes, it looks like it." "Compare it to your signature on this deed." She produced another document. Side by side, the differences were subtle, but undeniable to a trained eye, or to the eye of a man who now questioned everything. The signature on the loan application was slightly too neat, the loops a fraction too perfect. She forged it. Michael breathed, a fresh wave of anger washing over him. The conniving. "Potentially," Miss Thompson said calmly. "It's enough to raise a significant red flag. More leverage. We're building a very strong case, Michael. Piece by piece." The legal chess match had begun, and Michael, with Eleanor Thompson as his queen, was starting to see a path through the wreckage. To delve deeper into the tangled web of Sarah's financial dealings, Eleanor Thompson recommended they bring in a forensic accountant. "Arthur Bellwether," she said. "He's a bloodhound when it comes to finding hidden money. Expensive, but worth every damn penny." Michael agreed without hesitation. He wanted the full picture, no matter how ugly. Arthur Bellwether was a small, unassuming man with thick glasses and an air of quiet intensity. He spent days locked away with Michael's and Sarah's financial records, emerging periodically with new, unsettling discoveries. Mrs. Anderson was creative, Bellwether reported during one update meeting in Miss Thompson's office, a dry understatement that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. She set up a series of small, recurring transfers from your joint savings to an account under her maiden name. Individually, they're insignificant. Collectively, over 5 years, they add up to a substantial sum. He then presented evidence of cash withdrawals made from ATMs near hotels, where Sarah had claimed to be on charity business, but which corresponded with dates from her explicit texts with David Harper. But the truly devastating blow came a week later. Bellwether had been meticulously tracing a large, unexplained withdrawal from their main investment portfolio, made about 18 months prior. Sarah had told Michael it was to reinvest in a more stable, low-risk fund on the advice of a new financial advisor she'd met. This financial advisor, Bellwether said, adjusting his glasses, appears to be an associate of Mr. David Harper, and the stable, low-risk fund, well, it was a shell company, Mr. Anderson, registered offshore. The money, I'm afraid, is gone, likely untraceable. He presented a complex chart showing the money trail, a labyrinth of transfers ending in a defunct account. The sum was staggering a significant portion of their retirement savings. Michael stared at the chart, the numbers swimming before his eyes. It wasn't just the loss of the money, though that was a bitter pill. It was the calculated cruelty of it. Sarah, his wife, the woman he'd trusted with their future, had actively participated in fleecing him, conspired with her lover to steal the fruits of his life's work. The sheer audacity, the depth of her greed and foolishness, left him breathless. So she wasn't just his lover, Michael said, his voice dangerously soft. She was his business partner, or his mark. Perhaps both, Mr. Anderson, Bellwether replied quietly. Mr. Harper seems to have a talent for blurring those lines. The pain was a sharp physical ache, but beneath it, Michael's resolve hardened further. This wasn't just about a messy divorce anymore. This was about fighting back against a calculated, malicious act of financial destruction. He would not let them get away with this. As Michael and Eleanor Thompson meticulously built their case, Sarah was clearly growing agitated. The initial shock of Michael's cold fury had given way to a nervous energy. She made several attempts to speak with him, to work things out. But Michael, on Miss Thompson's advice, communicated only through his lawyer, a wall of professional detachment she couldn't seem to breach. Panicked, Sarah turned to her other allies, Olivia and Chloe. One evening, the doorbell rang. Michael, engrossed in reviewing documents in his study, ignored it. But then he heard voices Olivia's sharp, insistent tone, Chloe's softer, more hesitant one. They'd let themselves in with their old keys. He found them in the living room, standing awkwardly. Olivia, ever the spokesperson, stepped forward. "Dad, we need to talk. This has gone on long enough." "Has it, Olivia?" Michael replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "I was under the impression it had been going on for several years without my knowledge." Olivia flushed. "That's not fair. Mom made a mistake. A big one, yes. But this cold shoulder, lawyers, it's tearing the family apart. Think about the holidays, Dad. Think about your grandkids someday." Chloe wrung her hands, her eyes redrimmed. "Daddy, please. Mom is a wreck. She cries all the time. She loves you. Can't you just try to forgive her? For us?" Michael looked at his daughters, at their earnest, pleading faces, and felt a profound sense of disappointment. They still didn't get it, or more accurately, they refused to. Their concern wasn't for his pain, for the decades of lies he'd endured. It was for the disruption to their own lives, the potential loss of their comfortable family dynamic, the fear of their mother's instability. "Your mother isn't a wreck because she's remorseful, Chloe," Michael said, his voice cutting through her tears. "She's a wreck because she's been caught, because her comfortable life, built on my trust and my money, is about to unravel." He turned to Olivia. "And you, Olivia, you talk about tearing the family apart. Who do you think did that? Did I invite a predator into our lives? Did I systematically lie and steal from your mother for years? Did I enlist my children to help me cover up my betrayals?" Olivia recoiled as if struck. It wasn't like that. We were just trying to keep the peace." "Whose peace, Olivia?" Michael shot back. "Yours? Your mother's? It certainly wasn't mine." He saw the dawning realization in their eyes that their usual tactics, Olivia's confident reasoning, Chloe's emotional appeals were having no effect on this new, hardened version of their father. They were still operating under the delusion that this was something that could be smoothed over, a family squabble that could be resolved with a few tears and an apology. They had no concept of the abyss of betrayal their mother had plunged him into, or the depth of their own complicity in his suffering. They were, in their own way, as blind as he had once been. With a mountain of evidence compiled from the intimate details of the affair to the cold, hard facts of financial malfeasance, Eleanor Thompson decided it was time to make the first move. "We're going to send Sarah's lawyer a preliminary settlement proposal," she informed Michael. "It will be aggressive. It will outline, in no uncertain terms, the extent of what we know and what we are prepared to prove in court if necessary. This isn't about negotiation at this stage. It's about showing her we have all the cards." The proposal, drafted by Miss Thompson, was a masterpiece of legal precision and understated menace. It detailed the long-term adultery, citing specific dates and locations gleaned from Michael's investigation. It meticulously listed the assets Sarah had dissipated, the funds she had diverted with David Harper, and hinted at the forged signature on the loan document. The terms were stark. Michael would retain the vast majority of the marital assets. Sarah would receive minimal spousal support due to her conduct, and she would be responsible for her own considerable legal fees. There was no mention of the daughter's disinheritance yet. That would be a separate, more personal blow. A week after the proposal was sent, Michael received a frantic call from Sarah. He let it go to voicemail. The message she left was a torrent of accusations, disbelief, and feigned outrage. "Michael, how could you? After all these years, this document is insulting. It's lies. You're trying to destroy me. You have to call me. We need to talk. This isn't you." He listened to the message, his expression unreadable. It wasn't him, or at least, not the him she knew, the him she had so easily manipulated for so long. That man was gone. Sarah then tried to reach him through Olivia, who called, her voice tight with anger. "Dad, Mom is hysterical. What did your lawyer send her? She says it's full of outrageous accusations." "Tell your mother to speak to her lawyer, Olivia," Michael said calmly. "And her lawyer can speak to mine. That's how this works now." He hung up before she could argue further. The quiet that descended on the house in the following days was different. It wasn't the strained silence of unspoken accusations anymore. It was the heavy, charged quiet before a storm, the palpable tension of an enemy forced to confront the reality of their defeat. Sarah, Michael heard through the grapevine of suburban gossip that still reached him, via a sympathetic Mark Jenkins, whose wife was friends with one of Sarah's former confidants, was in a state of near collapse. She'd apparently visited her old friend Linda, hoping for a sympathetic ear and perhaps some strategic advice. Linda, however, who had always harbored quiet suspicions about Sarah's perfect life, had reportedly offered little comfort. "Well, Sarah," Linda had apparently said with a distinct lack of warmth, "you know what they say. You reap what you sow." The first shots had been fired. Sarah knew he wasn't bluffing. The meticulously constructed facade of her life was beginning to crack under the pressure, and the real storm was yet to come. Eleanor Thompson believed in making a statement. She also believed in strategic timing. The annual Willow Creek Cares charity gala, a glittering affair that Sarah had chaired for the past 2 years and considered the pinnacle of her social calendar, was fast approaching. It was the perfect stage. "She'll be there preening, playing the gracious hostess," Miss Thompson had said to Michael, a glint in her eye. "It's where her image matters most, and it's where the impact of this will be most pronounced." Michael had felt a flicker of unease at the thought of such a public spectacle, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Sarah's cold calculations, David Harper's smirking face, and his daughter's casual betrayal. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about tearing down the false idol Sarah had become. On the night of the gala, the Willow Creek Country Club was ablaze with lights and filled with the murmur of expensive chatter. Sarah, resplendent in an emerald green gown that probably cost more than Michael's monthly mortgage payment, was indeed holding court near the entrance, a champagne flute in hand, her laughter a little too loud, her smile a little too bright. She exuded an air of confident glamour, oblivious to the storm about to break over her perfectly coiffed head. As she was mid-anecdote with a group of prominent local figures, a discreet, professionally dressed man approached. He was a process server, hand-picked by Miss Thompson for his unobtrusiveness and efficiency. "Mrs. Sarah Anderson?" he inquired politely, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the din. Sarah turned, her smile momentarily faltering at the unfamiliar face. "Yes? You've been served." The man extended a thick manila envelope. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity. Heads turned. Sarah stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from her face, leaving her emerald gown looking garish against her suddenly pale skin. I don't understand," she stammered, her hand trembling as she reluctantly took the package. "It's a petition for dissolution of marriage, ma'am," the process server said, his voice neutral. "And a summons to appear. You'll want to have your attorney review these." He nodded curtly and melted back into the crowd. Sarah's eyes darted around, seeing the curious, pitying, and perhaps even satisfied glances from those who had witnessed the exchange. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled in an instant. She tore open the envelope, her hands shaking so violently she could barely read. The legal jargon was dense, but certain phrases leaped out at her. Irreconcilable differences, adultery, dissipation of marital assets, conspiracy with one David Harper. The blood roared in her ears. This wasn't just a divorce, it was an indictment, a public shaming. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy. She had to call David, he would know what to do. But when she tried his number, it went straight to voicemail. Again. A knot of pure panic tightened in her chest. The glittering ballroom suddenly felt like a suffocating cage. She had to get out. Humiliated, exposed, she turned and fled, the whispers and stares following her like a pack of hungry wolves. The day after the gala, while Sarah was undoubtedly reeling from her public humiliation, Michael sat in Eleanor Thompson's office for another, more somber task. The new will. Miss Thompson had drafted it with meticulous care, ensuring every clause was legally sound, every intention crystal clear. Michael read through it slowly, the black and white words stark and final. "To my wife, Sarah Anderson, from whom I am currently seeking a dissolution of marriage due to her egregious and sustained betrayal of our marital vows and her calculated dissipation of marital assets, I leave the sum of $1 and no more." Then, the part that still caused a dull ache deep in his chest, despite his anger. "To my daughters, Olivia Anderson, last name if married, and Chloe Anderson, last name if married, who knowingly and willingly participated in the concealment of their mother's infidelities and deceptions, thereby betraying my trust and the fundamental bonds of familial loyalty, I leave the sum of $1 each and no more. This decision is made with a heavy heart but a clear mind, as a direct consequence of their actions." He signed the document, his hand steady. It was done. "Now for the letters," Miss Thompson said gently, sliding 2 crisp, cream-colored envelopes and a pen across the desk. "It's best they hear it directly from you, Michael, however formally. It leaves no room for misinterpretation." He had agonized over these letters for days. He didn't want to rage, to recriminate. He wanted them to understand the depth of the wound, the finality of his decision. To Olivia, he wrote, "Your choices have consequences. You chose to align yourself with your mother's deceit, to prioritize her deceptions over truth and loyalty to your father. This is the consequence of that choice. I wish you a life that brings you more wisdom than you have shown me." To Chloe, his words were tinged with a deeper sorrow. "My dearest Chloe, or so I once thought. Your complicity, your willingness to sacrifice our bond to protect your mother's lies, has broken something in me that can never be repaired. I mourn the daughter I believed you to be. This is not an act of anger, but of profound and irreversible disappointment." He sealed the envelopes, the simple act feeling like a closing of a coffin lid. Miss Thompson would have them delivered by courier later that day. When Chloe received her letter, she was at her small apartment, a place her father's generosity had helped secure. The courier's knock was an unwelcome intrusion. She read the words, each one a hammer blow to her already fragile state. The formal, cold tone, so unlike the loving father she remembered, was devastating. She crumpled to the floor, the letter clutched in her hand, sobs racking her body. The full weight of her actions, of what she had lost, crashed down upon her. Olivia's reaction was different. She was at her office, a rising star in a competitive marketing firm. When she read her father's words, her initial shock gave way to a simmering fury. How dare he, after all she'd done in her mind to try and keep the family from imploding? He was being cruel, vindictive, utterly unreasonable. She crumpled the letter, her knuckles white, and threw it in the trash, a defiant anger burning in her eyes. He would regret this. She would make him regret this. But beneath the anger, a cold seed of fear began to take root. Her father, the man she had always, on some level, taken for granted, was capable of a ruthlessness she had never imagined. The public serving of the divorce papers at the gala was just the beginning of Sarah's social unraveling. Eleanor Thompson, with Michael's reluctant but firm agreement, had a further, more insidious plan to ensure Sarah's carefully curated image was irrevocably shattered. It wasn't about overt slander. It was about the strategic, anonymous dissemination of undeniable proof. A week after the gala, a plain, unmarked envelope arrived at the homes of several key figures in Willow Creek's tight-knit social circle, the Queen Bees of the Garden Club, the influential members of the country club board, the gossipy wives of prominent businessmen, the kind of people whose whispers could make or break a reputation. Inside each envelope were a few carefully selected high-quality printouts. One of the more damning Charleston photos of Sarah and David Harper, arms entwined, looking very much like a long-term couple, a redacted copy of one of the more explicit text messages, and an anonymous typed note that simply read, "Appearances can be deceiving. Some people are not who they seem. This has been going on for years." No return address, no signature, just the cold, hard evidence. The effect was immediate and devastating. The whispers started as a low hum, then quickly crescendoed into a roar of scandalized gossip. Sarah, who had built her identity on being the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the respected community leader, was suddenly exposed as a liar, an adulteress, a woman who had cuckolded her hard-working, well-liked husband for years. Her attempts to control the narrative, to paint Michael as a bitter, vengeful man, fell on deaf ears. The evidence was too compelling. Friends she had known for decades suddenly became distant, their calls unreturned, their invitations mysteriously drying up. The committees she had once chaired found polite excuses to replace her. The social world she had so carefully cultivated turned its back on her with a chilling swiftness. Mark Jenkins, Michael's friend, found himself at a poker game with a few other local husbands. The talk inevitably turned to the Andersons' scandalous divorce. One of the men, Bill Henderson, no relation to David H., a usually quiet accountant, cleared his throat. "You know," Bill said, looking uncomfortable, "I probably shouldn't say anything, but about a year, maybe 18 months ago, my wife and I saw Sarah Anderson having dinner with some guy at that fancy Italian place downtown, the one with the private booths. They were very cozy, holding hands, laughing. Didn't look like a committee meeting to me." He shrugged. "We didn't say anything to Michael. Figured it wasn't our business. Didn't want to break up a marriage if we were wrong." Mark stared at him. "You saw them? And you didn't tell me?" Bill looked sheepish. "Like I said, didn't want to get involved. But now, well, it all makes sense, doesn't it?" The news, when Mark relayed it to Michael, was another nail in Sarah's coffin. It wasn't just Michael's word against hers anymore. There were witnesses, people who had seen her deceit long before Michael had. Her isolation was now complete. The social shrapnel from Sarah's implosion didn't spare Olivia and Chloe. In a town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the sins of the mother were inevitably visited upon the daughters, especially when their complicity became part of the whispered narrative. The anonymous envelopes hadn't explicitly mentioned the daughters, but the story of their involvement in covering for Sarah somehow leaked out, perhaps through a disgruntled former friend of Sarah's, or even a careless comment from one of the daughters themselves in a moment of panic. For Olivia, the fallout was subtle but corrosive. At her marketing firm, a place where image and networking were paramount, she noticed a distinct cooling in her colleagues' attitudes. Lunch invitations became less frequent. She was subtly excluded from after-work drinks. Whispers would cease when she entered a room. Her boss, a woman who prided herself on the company's family values image, called Olivia into her office for a chat about maintaining professionalism and avoiding distractions. No direct accusations were made, but the implication was clear. Her family's scandal was a liability. The promotion she'd been angling for suddenly seemed a distant dream. Chloe, working part-time at a local bookstore while vaguely figuring out her next steps in life, faced a more overt, if less professionally damaging, form of judgment. Customers who had known her since she was a child now looked at her with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Old school friends, who had once admired her seemingly perfect family, now either avoided her or offered awkward, insincere condolences that felt more like condemnations. The casual cruelty of small-town gossip was relentless. "Heard your mom really did a number on your dad," one blunt acquaintance said to Chloe over the coffee counter. "And you girls knew all along? Rough." They both tried to defend their mother, to explain their actions, but their words sounded hollow, self-serving. They were no longer seen as the innocent daughters of a wronged father, but as extensions of their mother's deceit. The comfortable social bubble they had grown up in had burst, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. The letters from their father, disinheriting them, had been a private devastation. But this public shame, this constant judgment in the eyes of their community, was a different kind of torment. They were learning in the harshest way possible that actions and inactions have far-reaching consequences. The loss of their father's love and financial security was one thing. The loss of their own standing, their own identities separate from their mother's disgrace, was another entirely, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. The carefully constructed world Sarah Anderson had inhabited for 3 decades had not just cracked, it had imploded with spectacular force. Stripped of her husband's financial support, her social standing in tatters, and facing a divorce settlement that promised to leave her with a fraction of what she'd expected, desperation became her new companion. The calls to David Harper became more frantic, more pleading, but David, ever the opportunist, had scented danger the moment Michael's lawyers got involved. He'd seen men like Michael Anderson before, quiet, methodical men who, once roused, were relentless. David Harper was a predator, not a fighter. His voicemails to Sarah became shorter, more evasive, until finally they stopped altogether. He was a ghost. Left to her own devices, Sarah's composure frayed. The charming hostess, the compassionate charity queen, vanished, replaced by a bitter, shrewish woman consumed by self-pity and rage. She lashed out at Olivia and Chloe, blaming them for not managing their father better, for not somehow preventing this catastrophe. "This is all your fault," she shrieked at Olivia during one tearful, accusatory phone call. "If you'd been smarter, if you'd just convinced him to calm down, none of this would be happening. My life is ruined." "Our lives are ruined, Mom," Olivia retorted, her voice strained with her own anxieties. "Maybe if you hadn't lied and cheated for years, we wouldn't be in this mess." The old dynamic of daughter-mother deference was crumbling under the weight of shared disgrace. Sarah tried to play the victim card with the few acquaintances who would still take her calls, spinning tales of Michael's cruelty, his unreasonableness. But the whispers in Willow Creek were too loud, the evidence Michael's team had subtly disseminated too compelling. Her pleas for sympathy were met with polite but firm disengagement. The financial pinch was immediate and brutal. The joint accounts Michael had meticulously drained, under legal guidance to protect marital assets from further dissipation by her, left her with access only to her dwindling secret credit card funds. The electricity bill for the large family home still technically her residence until the divorce was finalized, though Michael had moved into a sterile corporate apartment arrived, a stark reminder of realities she'd never had to face. One afternoon, a local consignment shop owner, Mrs. Gable, a woman Sarah had always treated with a certain noblesse oblige, received a visit. Sarah, her face pale and drawn, her usual designer attire replaced by something less ostentatious, brought in several expensive handbags and barely worn designer dresses. "Just spring cleaning, Eleanor," Sarah said, forcing a brittle smile. "Making some space." Mrs. Gable, who had heard all the town gossip, simply nodded, her expression neutral. "Of course, Sarah. We'll see what we can do for you." As Sarah left, Mrs. Gable watched her go. a flicker of pity mixed with a certain grim satisfaction. The Queen of Willow Creek was selling off her crown jewels. David Harper had vanished from Willow Creek like smoke in the wind. The moment Sarah's carefully orchestrated life began to publicly unravel, the moment Michael's legal team had started to make serious inquiries about his financial dealings with Sarah, David knew his time was up. He was a con man, not a martyr. He'd extracted what he could from Sarah, a significant chunk of her and Michael's money, a comfortable lifestyle for a few years, and now it was time to cut his losses. His phone calls to Sarah ceased. His apartment, a small, stylish unit he'd rented under an assumed variation of his name, was found empty, cleared of any personal effects, save for a few cheap, disposable items. He'd left no forwarding address. But Michael, fueled by a cold, methodical anger, hadn't forgotten about David Harper. While Eleanor Thompson focused on the divorce, Michael had, on his own, continued his discreet online investigation into Harper's past, driven by a need to understand the full scope of the man who had helped destroy his family. He'd even hired a different, more specialized online investigator, a cyber sleuth, to trace Harper's digital footprints. The investigator, a young, tech-savvy woman named Anya Sharma, was good, very good. She managed to track David Harper's movements through a series of burner phones and new, hastily created social media profiles. He'd resurfaced in a different state, a sun-drenched Florida retirement community, already working his charm on a new target, another wealthy, recently widowed woman, a Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. He was using a slightly different name, a tweaked backstory, but his methods were sickeningly familiar. Anya provided Michael with a dossier, photos of Harper with Mrs. Ainsworth, screenshots of his new fake profiles, even recordings of his voice from a new dating app he was using, his practiced lines about being lonely but hopeful, almost identical to those he'd used on Sarah. Michael felt a surge of revulsion. This man was a virus, spreading his poison from one unsuspecting victim to the next. He couldn't let it continue. Through an anonymous encrypted email account set up by Anya, Michael sent a package of information to Mrs. Ainsworth. It contained edited highlights of Harper's history of deceit, a few of the Charleston photos with Sarah, and a stark warning. The man calling himself Daniel Hunt is a predator named David Harper. He preys on vulnerable women. Protect yourself. He is not who he says he is. He also sent a similar, more detailed package to the local police department in Mrs. Ainsworth's Florida town, flagging Harper as a potential serial fraudster and referencing the old, unresolved accusations from other states. He knew it might not lead to an immediate arrest, but it would put Harper on their radar. It was a seed planted. A few weeks later, Anya reported that Daniel Hunt had abruptly left the Florida community. Mrs. Ainsworth had apparently confronted him, and he'd bolted. He was on the run again. He hadn't been caught, not yet, but his latest scheme had been thwarted. Sarah, when she eventually, indirectly, heard whispers that David had been trying to woo another woman even while their affair was ongoing, finally, devastatingly, understood. She hadn't been his partner in passion, his soulmate. She had been a mark, a stepping stone, a fool, and he had discarded her as easily as he had all the others. The last vestiges of her romantic delusion shattered, leaving only a bitter, empty ache. Michael now lived alone in a furnished corporate apartment on the other side of town. It was clean, impersonal, and blessedly quiet. The grand family home on Primrose Lane, once a symbol of his success and happiness, now felt tainted, a monument to years of lies. He'd instructed Eleanor Thompson to ensure it was sold as part of the divorce settlement. He never wanted to set foot in it again if he could help it. The initial frenetic activity of uncovering the betrayal and setting his legal plan in motion had subsided, leaving a void. In the silence of his new, temporary life, the full weight of what had happened pressed down on him. There was a grim satisfaction, yes, in seeing Sarah's world crumble, in knowing David Harper was looking over his shoulder. Justice, in a cold, hard way, was being served. But there was no elation, no triumphant joy, only a profound, echoing sadness. He had lost his wife, the woman he had loved, or thought he had loved, for 3 decades. He had lost his daughters, their betrayal a wound that festered deep within him. The family he had dedicated his life to building was gone, revealed to be a hollow facade. He found himself wandering through the sterile rooms of the apartment at night. a ghost in his own life. Memories, unbidden, would surface: happy Christmases, family vacations, the simple, everyday moments that had once formed the tapestry of his existence. Now, each memory was tainted, viewed through the distorting lens of deceit. Had any of it been real? The anger was still there, a simmering ember, but it was now intertwined with a deep, pervasive grief. He had set out to achieve justice, and he was succeeding. But he was beginning to understand that justice, while necessary, did not equate to peace. It did not erase the pain. Eleanor Thompson, perceptive as always, had noticed the toll it was taking on him. "Michael," she'd said gently during one of their meetings, "you're carrying an immense burden. It's not a sign of weakness to seek help in processing this. I know a very good therapist, specializes in trauma and betrayal." He'd initially bristled at the suggestion. He was an engineer, a man of logic and control. Therapy felt indulgent. But as the lonely nights stretched on, as the weight of his shattered life threatened to suffocate him, he found himself reconsidering. Perhaps Miss Thompson was right. Perhaps even an architect of retribution needed help rebuilding his own foundations. Willow Creek was a town that thrived on gossip, and the Anderson divorce was the juiciest scandal to hit its manicured lawns in years. The initial shockwaves from the gala, the anonymous envelopes, and Sarah's subsequent social freefall had settled into a steady hum of speculation and judgment. Opinions, as they always are in such matters, were divided, though the scales had tipped heavily against Sarah. Michael, known as a quiet, hard-working, and devoted family man, was largely seen as the wronged party. There was a current of sympathy for him, a sense that he had endured an unimaginable betrayal with a stoic dignity. "Poor Michael," Mrs. Gable, the consignment shop owner, was heard to say to a customer. 30 years he gave that woman, and this is how she repays him. And those girls, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?" Others, a smaller but vocal minority, found Michael's actions, particularly the very public nature of Sarah's humiliation and the rumored disinheritance of his daughters, to be overly harsh, even cruel. "He didn't have to destroy her like that," one of Sarah's few remaining sympathizers might whisper at the grocery store. "And to cut off his own children? That's just vindictive." Olivia and Chloe bore the brunt of this public scrutiny. Their attempts to explain, to mitigate, to cast their mother in a more sympathetic light were largely met with skepticism or outright disbelief. They were seen as either deluded or complicit, their reputations inextricably linked to Sarah's. The town that had once embraced them now held them at arm's length, their presence a constant reminder of the messy, uncomfortable truth of human fallibility. Michael, for his part, maintained a dignified, almost monastic silence. He went to work, he saw his lawyer, he returned to his sterile apartment. He didn't engage in the gossip, didn't offer explanations or justifications beyond what was legally necessary. He let the facts, as they had been revealed, speak for themselves. His silence, in its own way, was more powerful than any defense or accusation. It conveyed a sense of profound injury, of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits and was now simply seeing things through to their inevitable, painful conclusion. The whispers and judgments of Willow Creek were just background noise to the quiet, determined execution of his plan. Months had passed since the initial cataclysm. The raw, gaping wound of betrayal had begun to scar over, leaving a dull, persistent ache in its place. Michael had settled into a new rhythm in his corporate apartment, a life stripped bare of the complexities and deceptions that had once defined his marriage. The silence, initially deafening, gradually became a space for quiet contemplation. He took Eleanor Thompson's advice and started seeing Dr. Evans, the therapist she'd recommended. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront the depths of his pain, his anger, and the profound sense of loss. But slowly, painstakingly, he began to unpack the baggage of 30 years of a life built on a lie. "You're grieving not just the end of a marriage, Michael," Dr. Evans had said gently, "but the loss of the reality you believed in. That's a profound trauma." He started taking long walks in the evenings, exploring parts of the city he'd never noticed before. He rediscovered his love for reading, devouring novels that transported him far from the wreckage of his own life. Mark Jenkins, His steadfast friend coaxed him back onto the golf course. His first few games were rusty, his concentration shot, but the familiar swing of the club, the camaraderie, the fresh air, it was a small, welcome anchor in the churning sea of his emotions. One Saturday, on an impulse, he visited the local animal shelter. He hadn't had a dog since the girls were young. He walked past cages of barking, hopeful faces until he saw him, a medium-sized mutt with sad, intelligent eyes and one floppy ear, huddled in the back of his kennel. The tag read, Buddy. Michael knelt. "Hey there, Buddy," he said softly. The dog lifted his head, his tail giving a tentative thump. An hour later, Michael walked out of the shelter with Buddy trotting happily beside him on a new leash. The apartment suddenly felt less empty. Buddy's quiet presence, his unconditional affection, his joyful anticipation of walks and ear scratches began to fill some of the cracks in Michael's fractured world. It wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost, but it was something new, something simple, something honest. He was taking small steps forward, learning to navigate the landscape of his altered life. The pain was still a part of him, a shadow that would likely never fully disappear, but it no longer defined every waking moment. The divorce proceedings were grinding slowly towards their inevitable conclusion. Sarah, through her increasingly desperate lawyers, made several attempts to renegotiate the harsh settlement terms, but Eleanor Thompson stood firm, armed with irrefutable evidence. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Michael was returning from a walk with Buddy, he saw them waiting on the steps of his apartment building, Olivia and Chloe. They looked diminished. Olivia's usual confident air was gone, replaced by a weary anxiety. Chloe's eyes were puffy, her shoulders slumped. He felt a familiar pang, a ghost of the love he once had for them, quickly followed by the cold memory of their betrayal. He'd instructed building security not to let them up unannounced, but they must have waited. "Dad," Olivia began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant as he approached. Can we talk to you? Please, just for a few minutes." He hesitated, then nodded curtly, unlocking the main door and leading them into the impersonal lobby. He didn't invite them up to his apartment. "What is it?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Buddy sat patiently by his side, looking from Michael to the two women with a curious tilt of his head. We wanted to say we're sorry," Chloe blurted out, tears welling in her eyes. "Really, truly sorry, Daddy. For everything. For not telling you. For helping Mom. We were wrong. So wrong." Olivia nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "She's right, Dad. We were stupid and selfish, and we didn't understand how much we were hurting you. We see it now. We've lost everything because of it." Her voice cracked. "We're not here to ask for money or to be put back in the will. We miss you. We miss our father." Michael listened, his expression unreadable. He could see the genuine remorse in Chloe's tear-streaked face, the weary regret in Olivia's downcast eyes. They had suffered, they were suffering, and a small, buried part of him ached for them. He took a slow breath. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, his voice even, "and perhaps in time you'll truly understand the depth of the choices you made. But an apology, even a sincere one, doesn't erase years of deception. It doesn't rebuild what was so thoroughly destroyed." He looked at them, his daughters, now almost strangers. "I don't hate you," he continued, the words costing him more than they knew. "Hate is too strong an emotion to waste on this. But the trust, the bond we had that's gone, irreparably. I can't forget what you did. I can't pretend it didn't happen." He saw the flicker of hope die in their eyes. "I wish you both well," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "I hope you learn from this. I hope you build better lives for yourselves. But our path together, it ends here." He turned, Buddy trotting beside him, and walked towards the elevator, not looking back. The door slid shut, a firm, metallic finality. He had heard their plea, acknowledged their pain, but the door to his heart, the one they had helped shatter, remained closed. He was no longer driven by raw anger, but by a clear-eyed acceptance of the unalterable past. He had chosen his own peace over their desperate need for absolution. The divorce was finalized on a gray, drizzly Tuesday in November. There was no courtroom drama, no last-minute appeals. Sarah, facing the mountain of evidence Eleanor Thompson had amassed, had finally capitulated. Her lawyers had accepted the settlement, a mere fraction of what she would have received in an amicable split. Michael sat in Miss Thompson's office as she went over the final documents. The family home on Primrose Lane was to be sold. The proceeds heavily weighted in Michael's favor to compensate for the assets Sarah had dissipated. Sarah would receive a small, court-mandated spousal support payment for a limited time, barely enough to maintain a shadow of her former lifestyle. She was, for all intents and purposes, financially ruined. "It's done, Michael," Miss Thompson said, offering a rare, small smile. "She'll have to sell the house, obviously, and quickly. She won't be able to afford the upkeep." A quiet sense of closure settled over Michael, not triumph, not elation, but the grim satisfaction of a difficult task completed, of accounts finally, irrevocably settled. The bad guys, as it were, had been brought to justice. A few weeks later, news trickled through the Willow Creek grapevine. David Harper, whose trail Anya Sharma had continued to monitor discreetly, had finally overplayed his hand. His latest attempt to defraud a wealthy retiree in Arizona had been clumsy, his usual charm wearing thin. The woman, perhaps more astute than his previous victims, or perhaps alerted by an anonymous tip similar to the one Michael had sent to Mrs. Ainsworth, had contacted the authorities early. Combined with the flags already on his record from Michael's previous intervention, the local police had enough to arrest him. The charges were serious: fraud, grand larceny. His picture, a tired, haggard mugshot, even made a small appearance on a national news website covering white-collar crime. He was facing significant jail time. Michael read the article online, a single nod his only reaction. The serpent had finally been defanged, and Sarah? The sale of the Primrose Lane house was swift and, for her, brutal. She was forced to move into a small, rented apartment in a less desirable part of town. The designer clothes were sold, the expensive car repossessed. She took a low-paying retail job, the irony not lost on the few who still paid her any mind. One afternoon, Michael, driving through a part of town he rarely frequented, saw her walking out of a discount grocery store, her face etched with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the street. There was no recognition in hers, only a dull, defeated emptiness. He felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a vast, echoing indifference. The final account had been settled. He had his justice. And, in a strange, quiet way, he felt a burden lift. A year later, the autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold along the winding country road that led to Michael's new home. He'd sold the sterile corporate apartment and, after the Primrose Lane house was finally off his hands, bought a small, rustic cottage on a few acres of land an hour outside the city. It was quiet, peaceful, surrounded by trees and the gentle murmur of a nearby creek. The divorce was a closed chapter. Sarah was a distant, unpleasant memory. Olivia and Chloe, he heard occasionally through Mark Jenkins, were struggling to rebuild their lives, their relationship with their mother strained, their futures uncertain. He felt a detached sort of sadness for them, but no inclination to re-engage. The wounds were too deep, the trust too irrevocably broken. He had Buddy, of course, now a happy, well-adjusted companion who followed him everywhere. He'd taken up woodworking, his engineer's mind finding satisfaction in the precision and craft of creating something beautiful and tangible from raw materials. His small workshop at the back of the cottage was filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish. He'd even reconnected with his estranged younger sister, who lived a few states away, their conversations a tentative bridge back to a family connection untainted by betrayal. He still saw Dr. Evans occasionally, not out of crisis, but for maintenance, like tending a garden that had once been ravaged by a storm, but was now slowly, carefully being replanted. One crisp morning, Michael sat on his porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, Buddy lying at his feet. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and luminous gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He wasn't the same man he had been 2 years ago. The betrayal had carved deep lines into his face, had silvered his hair more than time alone would have. The scars were there, visible and invisible. But the bitterness, the raw, consuming anger, had faded, replaced by a quiet strength, an earned peace. He watched the sunrise, a slow, majestic unfolding of light and color. He had faced the darkest parts of his life, had navigated the treacherous waters of deceit and retribution, and he had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. He had not forgotten, but he was no longer defined by the betrayal. He had reclaimed his life, forging a new path on a different shore. A small smile touched his lips. He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He had survived. More than that, he was, in his own quiet way, beginning to thrive. The long night was over. A new day had dawned,